Heather and I had our third grandson. And Friday, Bailey had Bo Allen Dodds as, they pick names that if in the future they become professional golfers, it would be a cool branding thing, I think. You know, everybody's looking to brand their kid later on in life. The Insta moments, right? Or whatever it'll be called then, because nobody will do an Instagram in that day, in 20 years from now. So, okay, let's get into and we see is this a little girl over here too? How old?
6 weeks.
6 weeks, oh, yeah. So, how many kids? 4. 4 kids, keep it going. You're doing good. Be fruitful and multiply is the theme of this morning's message. If you're watching online, we're glad you're with us. We're in a series called POV, and I've already shared it was point of view, and we're going to take a look at the second sign. The first sign last week we talked about is very important. You know, some of the most remarkable people we've ever met could be described with these words: believe in spite of people. How many of you have ever met people that no matter how difficult the circumstances are, they believe in spite of the financial issue they're in, or the relational issue they're in, or the health issue they're in? They have confidence in God, and their confidence in God is unshakable. They still have joy even when things aren't going well. They still have peace when things aren't peaceful around them. It almost defies logic because everyone else is trembling by what's happening. And you look at what's taking place now in Iran, and it's just like, how many are getting to feel like as soon as one thing's done, it's like something else has to happen, right? And things that would have been an annual thing has now become a weekly thing, where it's just constant. And we're living in a moment where we can be this kind of people. We can be people of peace that are walking in peace and in faith that defies logic with everything around us. And it's an opportunity to be a light to a world because we carry something that they don't have access to yet. Philippians 4, 6 through 7 says, be anxious for nothing. Be anxious for nothing. But in everything by prayer and supplication, or another word is prayer and petition. Thank you. My brain just went. With thanksgiving. The thing we just read over often is the part of thanksgiving. Because how many are not thanking God for the trial they're walking through? Right? But a part of this whole thing that Paul is saying, he's like, when you pray, thank God that you're walking through it. Thank God that you're walking through the difficult time that you're facing. And a lot of us are like, this is the devil, and it probably is in most cases, but thank God that the devil tried to work on you in that way because he's about to work something out through you. Let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, meaning it doesn't come to you because God explained it to you. God didn't explain to you what happened. God didn't even necessarily show you the victory in it. You just have the peace of God because you know who God is. It is not understanding that gave you peace. It was knowing who He is that gives you peace. See, it's hard to live as people of peace if we don't have peace when there's nothing wrong, or when there's peace when everything is wrong. The peace is consistent because we know who God is. And He'll guard your heart and your mind through Christ Jesus. So there's a faith that's so strong, you wonder if people might be in denial. And they're not. They just trust God, and it's inspiring. We all know at least one kind of person like that. Maybe you're like that. Can you think of right now one person maybe in your life that even though they're facing some incredible issues, they just have faith? They're immovable. Like they just know who they are. They know who God is. And really everything flows out of how we see God. How you define God and how you define yourself, everything flows from that. There is a doctor by the name of Dr. Francis Collins. Dr. Francis Collins met people like this. They just had immovable faith, doing rounds in med school at North Carolina. He eventually would be the director of the Human Genome Project, and a genome is an organism's complete set of DNA. Now, I know you already knew that, and I'm sorry if I'm insulting your intelligence, but every organism has a genome. Every organism. It's a complete set of their DNA and includes all of the genes. So Dr. Collins was given the assignment to map the entire human genome. Now listen to this, 3.1 billion letters inside of every single one of your cells. It's incredible. It really is a remarkable accomplishment. And why it was important is it would help experts predict what diseases would eventually do and give revelation on how diseases would affect families and lineages. So I think we would all agree he's a pretty smart guy, right? This isn't some guy that was uneducated or not a learned person. At 27 years old, as a med student, while doing his rounds on the floor, he would love to ask patients questions. And he would ask him really almost the same questions every time he would meet someone. He would ask them very similar questions, and he was doing his internship, so he got time to sit down and talk to them. And what he found interesting was he would keep running into patients that were Christians. And these Christians were people with often terminal diseases, because it's who he was working with, and they had terminal diseases that couldn't be cured. And he would talk to the Christians about how they were handling it and how they were facing it, how they were facing the same end-of-life issues as all the other people. And so many of them would end up talking about their faith, either going to heaven, being reunited with loved ones. And this was somewhat perplexing to Dr. Collins, because he grew up in a home where his parents were agnostic, and he didn't really consider God. In many ways, he thought he was just some make-believe story that people told, and he was nice and he wasn't harmful, but he had no real opinion of him. So it was a little unnerving to him when these Christians would put their faith in this Santa Claus or Easter Bunny. He wrote a book after he had this experience called Language of God. And this is what he would write in the book. I read this excerpt that he had put out from the book. And here's one of the things that was highlighted. He said, "If faith was a psychological crutch, it must be a pretty powerful one. If it was nothing more than a veneer of cultural tradition, why were these people not shaking their fists at God and demanding their friends and family stop all the talk about a loving and benevolent supernatural power?" His tension that he was facing was, if this is just the tradition, if this is something that just uneducated people do, if it's something that just weak-minded people do, if it's something we celebrate like Christmas, Santa Claus, and Easter Bunny, why are these people so confident, so firm in what they believe? These people were dying, yet their faith was growing even stronger. And what's interesting, what he found was they may have even been nominal in their faith, but when they faced these difficult times, it's like they went to the deep end of the pool. Their faith didn't weaken, it actually got stronger. One day, he was on the floor and he walked into a room where a woman he had had conversations with in the past and met and talked to before was dying of heart disease, and there was no hope for her. She was going to die. And she was one of those people that had such firm faith, and it astounded him. Really, she was one of the strongest he had ever met by her faith, that when watching how she had faith. Well, one particular day as they were chatting, he was filling out a chart, and the woman turned and looked at him and said, "Doctor, I have told you what I believe, but doctor, what do you believe?" And it was that question that began to change his POV. It began to challenge him for the first time, and he stammered because he didn't know how to actually answer the questions he had been asking everybody up to that point. And he just simply said, "I'm not really sure. But later, after considering it, when you thought about the question she asked, like, yeah, what is it that I believe? I've just assumed that it's interesting, it's an interesting observation, but there really is no truth that I'd love to know why it's that way. He said, faced with a willful blindness and my ignorance, I began a new journey. What he realized was he had never really considered it. He had never stopped to consider that what he was brought up with might not be right. That maybe it isn't Christians that should deconstruct. Maybe it's agnostics that should deconstruct their way of thinking. Where they say, it's amazing how it's always, God is not right, so you need to deconstruct. And maybe you're online, maybe you grew up believing there was no God, so convinced he doesn't need to, that he doesn't exist. And it's your willful blindness and arrogance and ignorance that's preventing you from seeing what's obvious to so many people. And it was in that moment he discovered there was more evidence than he knew there was. And his POV changed. In fact, almost every story that you hear about guys or women that believe there is no God, they end up writing books about how they set out to prove there is no God, only to discover the evidence actually says there has to be. That all of this that's in the Bible isn't based on just that faith, brother. You got to take it by faith, sister. But it's actually faith based on eyewitness accounts that actually happened. And he didn't believe because he had a past where people he trusted said, I don't think there's anything there. Only to discover they didn't have any idea what they were talking about. And it all started when he made the decision to consider. Maybe you're here and you don't believe in God. You've just written it off. You've allowed things that have happened in your life to bring you to the conclusion that there couldn't be a God because if there was, this wouldn't have happened. You've allowed, what we would say, is you've allowed the enemy to define or interpret things that have happened in your life in a way that removes God from the equation. And I'm here today, like Dr. Francis, who is a very smart man, came to the conclusion, I need to consider. And that's what I'm going to ask for you today. If you're in the room and you don't know what to believe, or you haven't believed this, that maybe today it's time for you to just simply consider. Jesus predicted this. Jesus gave us evidence to believe that Christianity is not just about believing and taking it by faith, but all the disciples believed because they saw and they experienced. They didn't just follow Jesus because of faith. They didn't follow him because of hope. John encourages all of us to believe in Jesus because what he saw and what he heard. That we put our faith in Jesus because of the eyewitnesses of that day and what they saw and what they heard. And John was a credible eyewitness. You say, well, you know what? I don't know. If I believe the whole eyewitness thing, that I'm going to believe the eyewitness. I don't get into that. Actually, you do. That's our whole justice system. The most credible evidence of truth was the eyewitness accounts that sit on the stand. It's called a witness stand. And they give you what they saw. And people make judgments on criminals based on eyewitness accounts. You weren't there, you didn't see it, but you believe they're guilty because you give credibility to eyewitnesses. John was a credible eyewitness. 1 John 1:1, look at what he says. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled concerning the word of God. He touched him. He was there. He saw him. He says, man, I get it. I get where you're at. I was there. I didn't believe. I was there more to find out if he was the Messiah. And listen, I went and saw him, and I realized he's not a mirage, he's not a myth, that all of those questions I have were answered in the time that I was with him. John was a simple man. He's like, I grew up believing in God. I always ask the same questions. Is God real? Has anyone really ever seen God? When things didn't go right in my life, was God punishing me? Did God care? John's like, I had all those same questions. And then I met Jesus. I had all the same questions you do. But then I met him. Then I believed in him. And now I would die for him. Verse 2, it says, the life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness and declare to you that eternal life which was with the Father and was manifested to us, we have seen God in the flesh. So he said, I'm going to write this book, this gospel we call the Gospel of John. And John was not content to just tell us the stories of what happened. He wasn't there to write a history book. John had an agenda. John wanted something to happen in you in the same way that it happened in him. He wasn't interested in writing history lessons. He was determined to bring each of us on a journey of discovering faith in Jesus as Christ, the Son of the living God. And he says it in verse 30 of chapter 20. He says, Jesus performed many other signs. He did all kinds of miracles. But I'm not telling you all about the miracles he did. It's just to add in, because if I do, you're going to miss the signs. He says, I want to show you the signs, the miracles that happened that weren't just acts of random kindness, the miracles that happened that became the signs that pointed to who he was and what his identity was. He says the signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. Jesus did many more, he says, than that. And then in verse 31, he says, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And he organizes this journey around 7 signs that he mentions in the Bible. And today, we're going to talk about the second sign. If you want to know the first one, that was when he turned water into wine last week in Cana. This week, we're going to talk about the healing of the nobleman's son. Now, I want to take you back to the wedding. He turns water into wine. You know, Jesus basically says, I didn't come to save weddings, I came to save the world. And then Jesus goes to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And anytime he goes to Jerusalem, Jesus kind of gets in trouble. He stirs the pot, and he doesn't really tread softly. He's very bold with the religious leaders. And it's interesting because the religious leaders, if you would look at the religious leaders back then today, you would think they're very good people. They fasted, they read the Bible, they prayed, they didn't miss any of the time. They treated some people with contempt, but they also spent a lot of time doing all of the things, just standing at the wall, in the temple, praying and talking to God. And they did a lot of talking. I don't know that they did a lot of listening. But this time, Jesus was disturbed when he went to Jerusalem, because when he goes in the temple, he eventually drives out the money changers because they were taking advantage of the people. Another time he confronts people for bringing their leftovers to him. The people were bringing the leftovers to God and keeping the best for themselves, which is essentially the tithe. And the religious leaders found themselves asking, who do you think you are? When they should have been saying, what do you think you're doing? And Jesus answers all of this. John tells us that many people saw what Jesus was doing, and many people saw the signs he was performing, and they believed in his name, which gives us this formula for believing. Seeing is believing. Then he goes on to the famous conversation he has with Nicodemus. Remember, he says, you must be born again. He's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, you're a religious leader, you should know. But he doesn't. Then finds himself at a well with a woman who has had 5 husbands, and the one she's currently with is not her husband, in a very scandalous setting. And eventually this woman is so convinced he's the Messiah, she goes and gets her city and brings them to him. It's right here I want to pause for a moment. If you have the answer to the problems of our city, why wouldn't we share it with everyone in our city? I'm just going to put a pin there. Then Jesus heads back to Galilee. And that's where this story begins here with the healing of the nobleman's son. Go to chapter 4, verse 46. It says, once more, he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick in Capernaum. For the first time he did the sign, he enters a joyous occasion for a wedding. In this situation, he's going to step into a heartbreaking occasion. And that's what Jesus does. He steps into and gets involved in your daily activities. Now, Capernaum, by walking, is about 8 hours from where Jesus is at in Cana. If you have a chariot, which this royal official probably has, he's about a 2 to 3 hour journey from Capernaum to Cana. This desperate parent is called a royal official. Some texts say he's an aristocrat, so he's wealthy. He's probably a Sadducee, and you're like, well, how do you become a Sadducee? Well, he was sad, you see. You just don't want to laugh. I mean, that was just a softball that even give a courtesy laugh, right? There are two ruling classes of people. They're the Pharisees and they're the Sadducees. And the Pharisees were very religious. They kept the law meticulously. They believed that God was involved in the details of life. And they believed, and this was the big one, they believed there was a resurrection after the dead. But the Sadducees were on the other side. They were more intellectual. They were more humanistic. They were not sure about the resurrection after life. And they believed that everything was determined or predestined. Your health, your children, your career, your spouse, your class, everything, fate dictated everything. So the story of the Good Samaritan, when they walked past, you say, how could they walk past somebody who was beaten and laying on the side of the road? They were likely Sadducees. They would have believed that that man was getting what was coming to them. He was being punished by God. So for them to interrupt and help the man would be interrupting God from doing what God intended to do. That was their viewpoint. And this desperate father's theology changes when his son gets sick. Isn't it amazing how our theology changes when we face desperate situations? You could say you don't believe in God, but as soon as you get that report that there's cancer, maybe you start believing there could be a God. And isn't it interesting that everything he said he believed, he pushes to the side when someone he loves faces suffering. All the pride, all the stubbornness, all the perceived theology gets pushed to the side. It goes on and says, when the man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. This royal official doesn't get a sermon. Now, here's my theory. I'm sure this royal official's wife heard Jesus was back in town and she says, you go get him and bring him here. And it's like, don't send a servant. You're going to go get him. Do not take no for an answer. And you bring him back here right now. And this man has to make a decision to leave his dying son. He may never talk to him again. In order to bring back a man he only heard about, that he only heard stories and rumors about. And this royal official humbles himself and goes and begs Jesus to help his son. He lays down his dignity. He lays down his pride. He forgets everything else. He forgets his theology. He's committed to do whatever it takes to get Jesus to come and heal his son. How many have actually been in a situation where you would do anything for your child to be healed? You've been in that. And when I'm talking about it, you know what I'm talking about. He goes on, he says, unless you people, and this is Jesus speaking, he says, unless you people see signs and wonders, Jesus told them, you will not believe. Now, it seems pretty insensitive, doesn't it? This man's son is dying. And Jesus makes a statement where he says, unless you see signs and wonders. Actually, in this passage, when you read it in the original Greek, it can also be interpreted this way. Jesus is saying, the only way you'll believe is if you see signs and wonders. Jesus knows. He's actually identifying the fact that his expectation wasn't just for you to believe what he was saying. His expectation was you need to see the signs and wonders and then you'll believe. That there was an actual formula. Like he's like, I'm not condemning you for needing signs and wonders. I'm basically affirming that you need to see these signs and wonders, believe. And it's true that Jesus, he becomes very serious about it. He says, there is no way you're going to believe accept me unless I do something that convinces you, because seeing is believing. So he performs the second sign that says, this is who I am. And literally, our faith, Jesus does something so amazing that people will talk about it for generations, for 2,000 years. Goes on to verse 49 and says, sir, come down before my child dies. And the Lord, by the standard of society, he's saying, I'm above you. But in this moment, I'm below you. I know most people are appalled by the fact that I'm even interacting with you. They're appalled that I'm even coming to you. I don't care. I'm placing myself underneath you because of your authority. I'm placing myself under. The man is saying, you know what? Maybe in the class of everything, I'm here and you're here. But I am desperate right now, and I'm going to place myself, I'm humbling myself. And even though there are people who say I'm a fool to do this, you're my only hope. You're the only hope I have for a Savior. Friend, this is salvation. It's when you lay everything aside and you humble yourself and say, you're the only one. This man comes to that place, and he notices the man's confidence. And you may ask, why is he so confident? Why is this man so confident that Jesus, if he comes, his son will be healed? Here's why. Why would he take the trip? Why would he leave his son's bedside? Very simple. Because of what he heard. Because of the stories and the rumors and all of them. He had heard what Jesus did. And he's like, if I can just get this Jesus who's done these things. This man had heard the stories of eyewitnesses of what he did. People who had seen him heal. And he said, if I can get him to come and heal my son, he'll do that for my son. And the man sees two options. He says, one, Jesus comes with me, and the rumors are true, and my son is another one of his powerful stories, or he doesn't, and my son dies. But Jesus gives him a third option. Jesus asks this man to do something that he had been asking people to do his entire ministry. Jesus asks the nobleman to trust him based on the testimony of other people. You say, Pastor, if seeing's believing, then I don't believe in God because I'm not seeing. But that's what this sign was. Jesus was saying to this man, this is the second sign. We don't believe because we've seen. We believe because there are eyewitnesses who have seen, and I believe them. And he says this to the nobleman. He says, listen, go, your son will live. The Greek text actually says it this way. Go about your business. No need to hurry, no need to worry. Jesus was not coming, but this man had nothing to worry about. You think this man, what's going through his mind, he's like, wait a minute, excuse me. You want me to do what? I'm not coming with you. I really don't want to walk all the way to Capernaum. But you came because you thought I could do something. Now I'm telling you to go. Just go. Trust me. He's like, you want me to go home without you. If I go home without you, there may be 2 deaths in my family. The man is faced with this thought: can I trust this man they call Jesus? Or do I take Jesus by force and make him do this? And this is where we all live. This is where every one of us live. These are the stories that weren't just meant for random acts of kindness. Jesus was giving you and I a sign for having faith for the rest of world history, that Jesus wasn't going to be there. Jesus is likely not going to show up in the flesh in your circumstances. But he says, do you believe the stories you've heard from eyewitnesses? Then if you do, go. It's done. See, here's the thing I think most people lose in all of this. Christ doesn't need to come and do what he's already done. We're asked to take Jesus at his word based on the firsthand testimonies of other people. We're asked to trust and entrust our lives to Jesus based on what they said happened. Our futures, our finances, our health, our careers, everything, our children, based on the words of people that knew him and had seen him 2,000 years ago. And for 2,000 years, people have been putting their faith in the testimony of those who witnessed what Jesus did. And they've seen the blessing of it. But for some reason today, Satan has somehow convinced people that those were all lies. If those were all lies, don't you think it would have all been deconstructed a long time ago? And yet we see people in this place all the time where their marriages are not restored yet and they keep believing. Kids who have not returned home and yet they still believe. People who haven't been healed and yet they still believe. They still have joy and confidence even though the circumstances are intimidating. Their faith is inspiring. People who remain faithful, even though they keep praying in the same prayers every night, not seeing anything change, even though they keep proclaiming the same victorious message, even though they keep claiming the same promises. Why? Because they have witnesses. That this isn't based on just that faith, brother. That there were people who saw it happen. And that's what John is saying. This is my POV, and I hope it becomes yours. The nobleman decided to believe Jesus. To live as though what Jesus said was true, even though there was no evidence of it. And in verse 50, it said, the man believed the word Jesus spoke to him, and he departed for home. He behaved as though Jesus could be trusted. He walked home by faith and not by sight. That's why faith comes from hearing. Hearing what? Hearing what other eyewitnesses saw. And something happens in us when we do that. While he was still on the way, his servant met him with the news that his boy was living. And when he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever broke, which caused him to be struck in awe. The father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, your son will live. And he takes off for home, finding his wife rejoicing because something miraculous had happened in their life. And it says later, he and his whole household believed. And this was the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. That seeing is believing, even when you have to wait to see. He didn't need to be a Jew to believe or a religious background. He just believed in Jesus. And we're all called to do something, to walk by faith. In fact, if you're not walking by faith today, my question is, what are you doing? You're living natural lives when God has called you to live supernatural lives. Like you don't walk supernatural roads without making supernatural decisions. Decisions which will require you to have God's help in them. Most of the decisions we make are evaluated and determined based on what I'm able to do. Very rarely based on what God tells us to do. Walking by faith, my friend, is not walking by hope. Walking by faith is not walking by wishful thinking. Walking by faith is living every single day of your life as though Jesus is who Jesus claimed to be. It's living every day of your life as though what Jesus said is true. Walking by faith is directly correlated to our view of God's identity. Which brings me back to where I was at in the beginning. You see, the reason we struggle to walk by faith is because we've given up on discovering who God really is. We let people define him for us. We go online and we let people who have no idea, people we've never met, define God for us. We've abandoned the scriptures, and more importantly than that, we've abandoned even the time of hearing his voice. And without knowing God, it is hard to walk by faith. But the second thing we do, which is even worse, because Kairos is the next weekend is such a great time to do this. And yet, I got so many other things to do than to take a weekend with God. Here's the second thing we tend to do. We don't know who he is, and so we have no access to really know who we are. We know who we were born to be. We know what our parents have maybe told us that we are, or people around us. We've never stood in front of the mirror of God's face. See, you've never looked right into your face. How you see yourself, whether you understand it or not, or even believe it or not, the truth is still the truth. You see yourself the way people have defined you. The way people have talked about you from the time you were a little kid when they told you were dumb, and all of a sudden you just believe I'm not that smart. You, whether you know it or not, have let other people define who you are. And when we don't get in front of the mirror of God's grace, if we don't get into the mirror of how God sees us, you will never know who God created you to be. You'll just be convinced by the deception of the devil that who you were born to be is actually what God did. Do you know God doesn't make mistakes? And yet there are things in you think are mistakes. I bet inside of you, you even think some of your weaknesses you wish God would change, and yet God said, I put weaknesses in you on purpose. I wanted you to be dependent on other people. You don't want weakness because you don't want to have to depend on anyone. That's the devil. What other lies have you believed you don't know about? Because you never stand in the mirror God puts in front of you. Because I ain't taking a weekend and giving it to God. He goes on in verse 29, chapter 20, says, because you have seen me, you have believed. Look at what he says in verse 29. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. That you're more blessed if you haven't seen as the eyewitness has seen, but you put your faith in what they saw. There's a blessing in it. And John thought it this way. He said this in verse 31. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So what's interesting is Francis Collins, if you would stand, makes this statement. I'm going to close with this statement. Because there's a lot of Christians that you believe because some Sunday school teacher told you that. Or maybe someone you trusted told you that, and you believe there's a God, but you don't realize that what you believe is actually logical. It makes sense. There's evidence. It's supported by evidence. So you go and live and you're afraid to tell anybody about Jesus because you're like, yeah, but what if I find out that it isn't based on evidence? Friend, it is. Dr. Francis Collins said this. It is not enough to read the notes on the page. At some point, you have to hear the music. At some point, it has to become alive. Like you can look at a page with notes and it does nothing for you. But at some point, You have to realize that all of this is evidence, and my life begins to live on earth as it will in heaven. That my life becomes the music of what was written on the page. That the world would hear the songs of heaven because they've watched your life. Just take a moment right now, if you would, and consider, do I really believe this stuff? And if I really believe this stuff, why is my life not bearing the fruit that truth should bear in me? That this evidence can bear in me? That I can reproduce the life of God and others around me. And that's what God's called us all to. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? Do you believe that? Yes. And we got to find the thing that's kinking the hose. Something standing in the way. Because you're really good at it, you just haven't discovered it yet. Did you know God created you to be incredible soul winners for the good news of the gospel? But something is preventing us from doing it. Because everyone in here, you're like Navy SEALs. That's who God created you to be. What is it that's robbing us of that opportunity of giving life? Amen. Will you bow your heads right now? Holy Spirit, I just pray in this moment that you would begin to reveal the thing that's clogging the hose right now in our life.